Hello everyone, welcome to Ask Coaches. I'm Yin Yao and I'm the host. In the next 20 minutes, we are going to learn about how coaching can be work in leadership and what kind of value can people get from coaching. So it's such my honor to have my guest here, Mike Thompson, and he's a highly experienced coach in leadership and also in emotional intelligence. How would you like to introduce yourself?
So I introduce myself as a leadership coach and consultant, and sometimes people say, what do you mean? And I will go into further detail saying that I help leaders in the corporate environment develop more engagement, better trust, help understand their own leadership style, and really just develop themselves to meet the needs of their environment in a way that doesn't take all of their energy.
Oh, leaders and environment and energy. How does these three things work together?
So one of the things that allows us to be effective in the workplace is when we can manage our energy levels effectively. So one of the things that we'll look at is how things like frustration, annoyance, impatience, things like that can really do a number, can really affect negatively our energy levels. And one of the things that happens once our energy levels get low is we actually stop processing information to the same way or to the same degree. So a good example is that when we get really stressed out, we actually change the way that our body processes information, in particular our brain and our prefrontal cortex. So a way to consider it is the difference between thoughtful top-down control of our prefrontal cortex versus bottom-up control or bottom-up processing of information. If you want, I can describe that just a little bit. But so the idea and the example I'll give in the classroom is that when let's say you're in the forest and your life is in danger, you're running away from a bear. In those moments, our bodies are not concerned about catching the common cold. They're not worried about our plans on the weekend. They're not worried about digestion. What becomes really important is seeing everything in your environment and being able to act appropriately. So you need to know, do I need to jump 2 feet to get across that creek or to jump over that tree? Or is that some safety I can get to? So what happens is we lose sort of our higher functioning in our brain for the purposes of taking in as much physical stimulus as possible. And so what can happen in the workplace is that if there's a significant degree of stress, what's going to happen is our ability to hold on to a lot of complex things, our memory gets affected, and so that can really hurt us. So if our environment doesn't work well with our personality and our behavior, it's going to cause us more stress.
Oh.
And so being aware of that can be critical.
That's very interesting. So what kind of people can benefit most from your approach?
Really anyone who's interested in developing themselves, whether that's as a leader or just as a human being in general. Mm-hmm. Those are usually the clients that I appreciate the most, that are open, honest, and really curious to make a difference for themselves in their life. Mm-hmm. In particular, leaders, that's where we like to focus a lot of our attention, but it's not just for leaders. We work with other people as well.
Oh, so how do you define leader?
How do I define a leader? That's a great question. So everyone has the ability to be a leader. Sometimes people think that if you're a leader, you have this sort of type A personality. That's not true. You can be a highly effective leader regardless of your personality. And maybe from that perspective, that's where that energy component comes in again. So we sometimes will see individuals who are, how would I say this? Maybe a little bit more extroverted, maybe a little bit more fluent in the way that they speak. They're maybe a little bit more demanding with their environment, and in that way, they can be seen as advantageous in the corporate environment because they're good at getting results. However, that doesn't mean that someone who's more subtle, someone who's more calm, someone who's more reflective can't be a great leader. We see many individuals like that who can be amazing leaders as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. Oh, so what do you think is something that you do differently as a coach compared to other coaches?
I thought about this question quite a bit, and I don't necessarily rub shoulders with a lot of other coaches enough to know how to answer that question. What I can say is that I tend to develop a very specific language with my clients as it relates to some of the tools that we use and as it relates to the trust that my clients and I can get into. So, for example, once you have a really strong foundation of trust with a client and you learn a little bit more about your client, you'll start to be able to pick up on characteristics or attributes that the client themselves deems as undesirable. And so as a result, you can get into some really interesting dialogue when, for example, a client starts to discuss their own limitations or things that they're upset about, and to really just help them through that dialogue and catch themselves and thinking, we don't necessarily need to go down that path, and is that really the way that you want to consider the situation? To be able to use some advanced psychometric assessment and to be able to help your clients understand that as well, I think is another added value that I have with my clients. I'm not sure, I know that it's pretty common for coaches to use psychometric assessments. I just happen to have quite a bit of experience in a variety of organizations and leadership styles. So to be able to kind of marry some of those things together, I feel is a skill that I have.
Oh, you marry those things. What kind of things together?
Well, for example, when we think of emotional intelligence, there's 5 major composites. We have self-perceptions, emotional expression, interpersonal decision-making, and stress management. And inside of those areas are different subscales. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll combine attributes of behavior and personality preference to things like emotional intelligence. So, for example, individuals who are highly extroverted, who communicate very quickly, what we can sometimes see there as well is a lower degree of impulse control. And so once we measure things like impulse control, it can really start to tell us a lot about how it is that we're going to engage with other people. And it's also going to give us some strategies for how it is that we can manage our extroverted tendencies, and also what things we can look for in ourselves. So to be able to have a discussion both from a behavioral perspective that says, how do you like to be in the world? How does that influence your stress levels? How does that serve you in your environment, given the work context that you do? And really be able to relate that to things like self-esteem, motivation, decision-making, the relationships that you have with other people, and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is like the best value that people can get from this kind of coaching?
So the best value that people can get from coaching is really when an individual is committed to improving themselves. So when we think about someone who's, say, being forced into coaching or being requested into coaching, if that individual doesn't have a coach that they can build a strong degree of trust with, and if that person doesn't feel as though they're in an environment where they can excel, then I don't think coaching would be valuable for them. However, if a person is in an environment where they can excel, where they do have a sense of control, and they do have the skills necessary, I think that coaching can be highly advantageous.
Commitment is very important.
Commitment is very important, and I think a general desire to improve oneself, improve our conditions, and improve our relationships, I think is another piece. Not that those all 3 have to be present, but just a genuine desire to improve a capacity in our life is really where coaching can be most effective.
Oh, I see. So like how do you know that this coaching relationship is working? Is like delivering value to the customer?
So that's a very good question. So how I want to answer that question is to discuss the difficulty in measuring the expense that coaching can alleviate or provide relief in. So what do I mean by that? In the corporate environment, it can be a little bit challenging or somewhat challenging to understand how much money we lose or the expense of a disengaged employee or the expense of having to constantly hire, constantly train, the expense of not having long-term tenured staff, so individuals who are consistent in their performance, who have the capability to jump into different roles. So sometimes what will happen is that if we have a high degree of disengagement, we tend to see a low degree of trust. We tend to see that the working relationships just aren't as effective. We see that productivity can go down, the quality of people's work can go down. And so where coaching can provide real value is being able to start supporting some of those things. So to be able to increase the relationships in the workplace, to increase the trust, to effectively resolve conflict, and not in a way that we're sweeping it under the rug, but actually in a way where we're having more honest dialogue and that we're able to resolve conflict in a way that's meaningful for both parties. And that would involve, in most times, a lot of honesty and even some compromise, but it can go a long way to sustaining and developing long-term relationships. So I think that's a big topic in the coaching world around what's the ROI and how is it that we can defend paying for coaching. And I think that for organizations and for decision makers looking to get into coaching, it would be to first have at least an estimate or an evaluation of what those expenses are. So how much money are you spending on training and retaining people? How much money are you spending on removing people from your organization? And genuinely, what opportunities do you see as it relates to increasing performance and having better working relationships?
Wow, there's lots of insight about those research and also like analysis.
And maybe just a final point there is that, again, from a traditional corporate perspective, if we buy a new piece of technology or a new machine on the shop floor, it's much easier to see how such a thing can increase our investment, right? Or how it can be a return on our investment, because maybe we're now more effectively producing units or we're having less waste, and all of those things are easy to measure. When it comes to the human capacity or the person's ability to engage in more work, take on more responsibility, and essentially get more done, that becomes a little bit more of a challenging piece to measure, especially because we don't all have the same ability and the same capacity. We all have different lives and different expectations going on in those lives. So
yeah, that's really hard to measure, like a human. Yeah, definitely. Another question I have is, like, as a coach, what do you think is the best thing and what do you think is the hardest?
In the coaching profession?
Yeah.
The best thing is the ability to have really honest and trusting relationships and dialogue with individuals who would, in most circumstances, not have those kinds of conversations. So the degree of trust that you can build with an effective coach is quite high. And in some instances, we don't often, maybe here in North America, we tend to have a lot more, and I don't mean this, to sound too critical, but we tend to have a lot more superficial relationships or superficial conversations. A good example being, how are you doing today? Good, right? And for some individuals, being able to unpackage that or peel it back a little bit to say, I'm actually not doing well, and there's some areas of my life that I'd like to improve, or there's some things that really I want to get off my chest. I think that is something that we struggle to have as human beings, especially now that technology is on the rise. I think truly honest and vulnerable dialogue is something that is maybe on a decline, and it's something that coaching can really supplement.
Yeah, that sounds like such a sacred thing to have. And I really I understand that when I was at the shop and selling things as people, I feel like people asking me how are you doing? This is the hardest question to answer. So what do you think is the hardest thing as a coach?
Good question. I think it's gonna depend coach to coach to coach. I think that for me, I can just answer that very, very subjectively, but one of the things where I struggle with is in individuals who are highly protective. So individuals who have a very strong ego, they have what I would say a very hard shell that they use to kind of protect the inner squishy person from the harsh outer world. And individuals who tend to have not only a lot of judgments about themselves, but about other individuals. And so those can sometimes be the more challenging conversations because we have to engage in a dialogue that says, we don't have to, but sometimes the experience is leading to a conversation that says, how is the way in which you see yourself and see this world allowing you to be more effective in the world? And in what way are you seeing yourself and seeing the world? And how might that be detracting or taking away from your ability to enjoy yourself, enjoy the world, enjoy your contributions? That's another thing that I think we have a lot of imbalance on, that there's no shortage of comparisons in this world, especially again with the rise of social media. It's very easy to compare yourself to someone else's highlight reel, and being able to have a realistic conversation about who you are, what you want to get out of this world, and where you want to go. To me is always a really valuable conversation, but depending on who you are and the experiences you've had, not everyone can have that altruistic outlook.
Oh, yeah.
So working with someone who has a very dark cloud above their head can often, as a coach, require more of my energy to sort of stay centered and not give in to someone else's view of the world. To be able to balance that out can require a lot more energy. Whereas on the other side of things, when an individual is keen, interested, curious, they know themselves a little better, they have enough trust with themselves and with hopefully the coach to have vulnerable dialogue where they're not putting up that face of, I'm doing great today, and, right? Where we can really maybe just go below the surface a little bit.
Oh, I see. That's very interesting point. Okay, the last question would be if you are going to give one piece of advice to those people who just want to become a coach, what would you say?
Two things. One would be to really learn the skill of listening. And I have a little saying, you only need an ear to hear, but listening is a skill. So what I mean by that is that to truly listen to what another person is saying, we have to be able to turn down a lot of our internal volume. So as someone else is speaking, our ability to just remove our judgments, remove our need to reload, remove the desire to figure it out, and to just truly listen to what somebody else is saying. And if you're wanting to become a coach, being able to practice that with friends and family members, in particular ones who you maybe disagree with, where our first reaction is maybe my first reaction is to become combative and interested in, having a critical dialogue, to take those moments to really soften, listen, and ask some questions without any kind of judgment. That would be the skill that I would encourage most individuals to practice before getting involved in any kind of coaching pursuit.
I think that's also very valuable in our daily life as well. Just listening. Wow. That's awesome. Thank you very much. And if people want to connect with you, where they can find more information?
So I can be contacted directly at mthompson@changeinnovators.com. Our website is changeinnovators.com, and we specialize in corporate leadership development, team development, and again, coaching.
Thank you very much,
No problem.
Michael.
It was a pleasure.